What's going on, everyone? Welcome back. But also, if this is your first time here, welcome. Today I will be continuing my Home Assistant install series by installing Home Assistant in a container. Now, when you hear container, you probably think Docker, but Docker isn't the only container tool available to us. There are alternatives, such as RKT, pronounced Rocket, Linux containers, and OpenVZ, to mention a few. Having said that, however, in this video, I will be utilizing Docker, Docker Compose, and Portainer. But I wanted to let you know that there are other tools available. The primary reason for making this video is because some single board computers, such as Raspberry Pis, are difficult to obtain right now. And you may simply want to experiment with Home Assistant without investing in separate hardware. However, with this type of installation, we are going to have to manage all of the upgrades, the OS, and add-ons that we install, as well as their data for backups. And all of this is achievable, but it's a little bit more involved. So if this seems interesting to you, let's go. Alright, so before we begin, I will say that the simplest way to use Home Assistant is with the full-fledged OS, as much of the software management is automated into the back end, and using a supervised install comes in second because you only have to worry about maintaining the OS software. But that is not why you're here. So we're left with container and core, and each of these come with a greater barrier to entry, as many people are hesitant to install these because you're going to have to handle everything yourself. But it's not as horrible as you might imagine. So let's go through with what we're going to have to deal with when we're doing a container install approach. So as we can see, with the container, we are not going to have supervisor, we're not going to have the add-ons, and we're not going to have backups. As well, supervisor will not be managing our OS for us. The supervisor component is a program that controls Home Assistant installation. It also helps with installing and upgrading Home Assistant and any add-ons you've loaded, and of course, the supervisor itself. The add-ons allow you to enhance Home Assistant's capabilities by installing additional apps that Home Assistant can integrate with, such as MQTT Broker, Node-RED, Grafana, and so on. Backups? Well, this lets you save your Home Assistant instance, called snapshots, any add-on data, configuration files, SSL data, and media. And finally, the managed OS is simply the host OS of Home Assistant that uses Docker as a container engine, but it's not based on a standard Linux distribution such as Ubuntu, but it is built with Buildroot and is optimized to run Home Assistant, which Supervisor takes care of as well. Okay, I'm sorry, but for this video, I am going to assume that you already have Docker, Docker Compose, and Portainer installed, as adding this to the video is going to make it longer than I'd like. But I have included the links to install these various pieces of software, like Docker, Docker Compose, and Portainer in the description below. So once you have those three items installed for your specific operating system, come back to this video and continue on. Alright, so in this video and most of my other videos, I do research before doing these videos and test to make sure that everything can kind of go as smoothly as it can. And all of this that I'm about to do can be done from the command line, but I prefer to demonstrate it to you graphically because it's a lot easier to understand than just typing a bunch of commands. And I chose these containers for Home Assistant because I believe they will provide a very similar experience to utilizing the full-fledged OS version. So to get an understanding of what containers I'm talking about, if we go over to my GitHub page and look at the Docker Compose file, the containers that I have chosen obviously is Home Assistant, but Visual Studio Code, a Mosquito Broker, ESP Home, and Zigbee to MQTT for demonstrating Zigbee devices. So our first step is going to be to establish a new stack in Portainer, where we will use this Docker Compose YAML file to define the containers we intend to use. We're only going to have to make a few changes to this file before we deploy. And that's going to be our path to our configs in our volumes. And essentially what this does is we're mapping a directory on our host computer the computer that you're going to be running this off of on the outside of the container to a container directory inside. And that's what this semicolon represents. So basically what we're doing is moving the persistent data outside the container, which is going to allow us to update, upgrade, or delete our containers without losing the settings or configuration for those containers. So I'm going to quickly add this in to give you some insight. And if you use any form of Linux, or if you just ever wondered about the directory structure of Linux, there's more information than you ever wanted to know if you just search the term file system hierarchy standard. So you search that term out, you will see what the file system is meant for, which will explain everything. So when we install software on a Linux machine, it is classified as an add-on application software package or optional, and it should reside in the /opt directory, as we can see here. But this is going to add a lot of extra steps for us because we'll have to start messing around with file and folder permissions, both inside and outside the containers. And I won't be going that depth in this video. So just simply select a directory which you already have permissions. And if this is going to be your permanent installation, just make sure that the location you choose makes sense. All right, enough nerd talk. Let's get on with it. So we're going to copy this Docker Compose YAML file. And when we go over to Portainer, we're going to go to the stacks icon, which is this one here. And then we're just going to add a stack, and I will name this Home Assistant, since that's what we're going to be deploying. And then we just go ahead and paste that in. Now I've already updated my volumes, the path to my configuration where I want everything to be stored, but there is one change that I want to make to VS Code because I want to have access to all of my containers configs. So I'm just going to remove the Home Assistant folder and use the Docker folder, which for me is the root directory in which all my containers are going to be installed off of. So once we have those changes made and everything in there, we can go ahead and deploy the stack. Now, since I have already downloaded the images, this is going to go a lot faster for me than it will for you because it will have to download each of those containers and then install them. So now we can see the stack has been deployed and we can see all of our containers running, with the exception of MQTT. So there's one more thing that we have to do to ensure that this MQTT broker works properly for us. If we just want to see what the error is, if we click on logs here, we can see that it's missing this mosquito.conf file. So we're going to have to create one and add it into this directory. So if we go back over to my GitHub page, I have included the project's mosquito.conf.file, but it's a pretty large file and you don't have to have all of this stuff in here. It can be stripped down to at the top here. If we click on this and look at the comment, it can be stripped down to just this. So I'm just going to copy this out. And then I'm going to go into my Docker directory and into Mosquito and into the config. And here we have to create a conf file. So let me make this bigger for you. You can see what I'm doing. All right. So now we can see we have a blank conf file. So let's go in and edit it. And then we'll just paste in what we copied out of the comment of the conf file. There may be other settings that you want to have for your mosquito broker. This is the minimum that I found to get it working. It's going to listen on port 1883. Persistence is true, and that data is going to be stored in this folder of the container, which we map to in our stack. Right here. And we also map to the mosquito log folder as well. And there's the log folder. We're going to allow anonymous mosquito users to connect. And if you want, you can go through the process of putting in a password file. So now we will just exit out and save this file. And now we can see that we have a mosquito conf file. So let's go back to our Portainer stack and select our MQTT container and hit restart. And now we can see that it is running. All right, now that we've deployed our container successfully and looking in Portainer here, it does look like everything is functioning. But we do have a few things to do in these containers yet, which we will handle as we encounter them. For now, let's move on to the Home Assistant onboarding. So we can either type in this IP address and the port, or we can just click on the published port here and it'll bring us to that. So here's the Home Assistant onboarding. So we can just go ahead and give our username and password information and create our account. This section is pretty simple. We'll just, as I said, simply enter your details for your new instance, select your home location, your elevation, time zone, unit system, currency if you want, and then hit next. And then choose whether or not to share anonymous information with the development team. This is going to allow them to provide support for any integrations or faults that you may face, as it gives them all of that information so that they can work on those bugs. In my opinion, I would answer yes to this because they will never know who the data is coming from, and it fits with the open source philosophy. All right, welcome to Home Assistant. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to enable advanced mode so we get more options for our administrative user. So just click on your name down here. And if you want to see that, you just click on here and it'll expand it out. So just click on your name and then scroll down to advanced mode and just turn that on. So now what? We have Home Assistant installed, but what do we do now, given we have no access to anything other than what we see? We don't have the add-ons, remember? And what happened to the containers we deployed? Where are those? I don't see them. Well, all the containers, if we go over to Portainer, we can see them here. And all we have to do to load them up is simply click on the published ports and we will see them. There's ESP Home, opened in a new tab. And if we open VS Code, actually, I could see that I've made a mistake. So I'll just correct that. The port that we have to map, and I'll make sure to change it on the GitHub page, should be 8080. So after we do make a change to our stack Docker Compose file, we just scroll down here to update the stack. And once that updates, then we should be able to load up our VS Code. Perfect. So we get this error because we're just running in not secured, but that's fine because it's just on my local network and no one else has access to it. So one of the first things we're going to need to do is have the ability to modify our config. In the Home Assistant folder, under the configuration.yaml, we can see that if we try to make any changes and save it, we're going to get an error that's telling us that we're unable to write to this file. It's permission denied. So we'll just discard that. Basically, what's going on is in the container, the user is not authorized to save files to our Home Assistant directory. So let's go into the container and fix that. So in Portainer, what you can do is you can click on VS Code, or under the quick actions, we can open up the exec console window. The command that we're going to use is a bin bash. Everything else we just leave default and hit connect. So in order to change the permissions to the folder where our Home Assistant config is, we need to first know who's the username or what's the username. So just type in who am I, and I'll just make that a little bit bigger for you. We just type in the command who am I, and it'll tell us the user. So in this container, the user is coder. So we're going to have to give coder folder permissions for our /config folder. So in order to give those proper permissions, we're just going to use the command sudo chown -R, the username, which is coder, and the folder we want to give these permissions to, which is going to be /config, and then just hit enter. So now we can disconnect, and if we go back to our stack and open it and go to our Home Assistant configuration.yaml and then try to make the same changes. If we hit X, it now is allowing us to save those changes. Perfect. But I don't really want to go to Portainer every time and load up in a new tab the different things that I want to use. As I mentioned, we want to try to make this as much like the full-fledged OS as we can. So if we look into some of the integrations that they have provided us, and we go into the front-end configurations, we can always do a custom panel in which we can provide the URLs, and then our software is going to sit here for us to click in. But I like the side panel. So if we look at the integrations, we can get that from the iframe panel. And the iframe just allows you to add, as it says, panels to the Home Assistant front end, and they're in the sidebar. So if we go into our configuration.yaml VS Code, and if you did close it, remember you can't open it just from clicking this publish port. And back in my GitHub repository, I do have the Home Assistant configuration.yaml, and what we're going to add is this first part here, which is the iframe panels. So we will just paste that in, and as we can see, it needs the IP address of the various things that we want to put in our sidebar. So if we go back to Portainer, we can see the IP addresses that we're going to use. So for Portainer, in order to get that IP address, I'll just have to jump out of the stack and go to the containers list, and we can see it here. I'll just copy that. And paste it in. For VS Code, we can go ahead and just type 0.0.0.0. It's going to be running on port 8080. And ESP home, we can do the same. And actually, because we have two that are running on port 8080, we will have to give it the IP address of one of them. So we will give it the IP address of the Zigbee to MQTT. and then we will hit the X to save it. And then if we go into our actual Home Assistant instance, we made a configuration change. So we go into our configuration settings, check to make sure that we haven't messed anything up, and then restart. So we'll just wait for Home Assistant to restart, and when it restarts, we should see some nice icons beside us here. Well, would you look at that? Now we're starting to get somewhere. It's starting to look like the same capabilities as the full-fledged OS. So the last few items that we're going to need to worry about are our MQTT broker and a few device port mappings. And now that we have access to Portainer, VS Code, the Zigbee to MQTT add-on, and ESP Home add-on, we can go ahead and close our additional tabs. Because as we can see within Home Assistant now, we can get that same information. I'm just going to minimize some of these, and same with Home Assistant to expand it out. You can expand out Portainer to see what everything is. So this is perfect. So if we go back into our stack, you see everything is running with the exception of Zigbee to MQTT. And let's see why that is. Well, we can see that we don't have an MQTT broker to connect to. So let's fix that. If we go back over to our GitHub repository, we can see we need to add in a few details for our MQTT. And the other thing we have to do is add a user for MQTT. So if we go over to people and zones and users, we're just going to add a non-admin user. You can name it whatever you want. I'm just going to use MQTT user like I have in all my past videos. Give it a password and then hit create. And then back to configuration, devices and services. Because we do have an MQTT broker container running, we just have to set it up in Home Assistant. So search for MQTT, and we need the IP address of our MQTT broker. So I'm just going to duplicate this page. It's going to ask me to log back in. So I'm going to go to Portainer and go to the containers and see that MQTT is running on this IP address. So we just have to enter that IP address in. Give it our username and password, which we chose. And perfect, we have MQTT now. So if we go back to Portainer, go back into our stack, Home Assistant stack, scroll down to the containers and check out our log. We can see that it's actually trying to connect to this IP address, and that's coming from the container itself. So we're going to have to change the Zigbee to MQTT configuration.yaml file in the container. And this is part of the reason why I wanted to be able to, in VS Code, make changes. It is not allowing me to connect. Okay, so back to our containers and open up VS Code in a port. I can see that it wants to run on 8443. So in our configuration.yaml, we are actually going to run our VS Code on port 8443 and save it. I'll close this, and with all configuration changes, we do have to restart. Check to make sure it's valid, and then restart. And now we should be able to access our VS Code within Home Assistant. Perfect. And here we can see we still have access. So as I was saying, if we look at the Zigbee to MQTT folder, we see another configuration.yaml. And there is a bunch of stuff in here that we can make changes to, and this is where it was getting that local host IP address from. So we just have to provide it the IP address of our MQTT instance. Now there are a couple other things in the GitHub repository. If we look at the Zigbee to MQTT configuration, we're going to want to add in the front end, and you can just copy this whole thing verbatim if you'd like, but I'll just copy the front end and make the changes in here. So the Home Assistant integration, we want to set true, and we want to give it a front end, a web GUI, which we can use. So we can close that. So now we can see that each of the containers is now accessible in Home Assistant on our sidebar. And to take it one step further, for the Zigbee to MQTT, I will just set a device to pairing and we'll see what happens. And we can see we have a temperature sensor. So we can edit this to change it to whatever we want. This is in a Kara temperature sensor. Let's call it Kara sensor and update the Home Assistant entity ID. Now, if we go back to our overview, we can see that the sensor data has been added to our Home Assistant instance, and it is picking up the temperature in the room that I'm sitting in. With all the computers running in here, it is a little warm. All right, well, this is where I'm going to leave you in the video. I hope that I have provided you with some value today. I hope you like what you saw and that you're able to get your container version of Home Assistant up and running. And if you want to add additional containers, just search for those Docker Compose files and add them to your stack. Goodbye.